Dobar dan. Lepo pozdravljeni na 4. dnevu mednarodne poletne šole politične ekologije. S predavanjem bo začela Irina Velicu, ki je politologinja na Centru za družbene študije Univerze v Koimbri. V svojem akademskem raziskovanju se ukvarja predvsem z vprašanji socijalno-okoljske pravičnosti, enakosti in družbenimi spremembami. Prispevku, ki ga je raziskovalka pripravila, se bomo ukvarjali in poskušali kritično pristopiti do usmeritev okoljske pravičnosti. Hvala, beseda Irini.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Okay. Thank you for coming. I know it's early in the morning. I'm also just waking up. And thanks for the invitation. As usually, I'm going to present a little bit of my, let's say, empirical research on the movement that is still my main focus of research, and that is Russia, Montana. Maybe some of you already heard about it. I was interested in this movement since my PhD when I was a student, so that's already 10 years ago or more, I can't remember. That's how long it takes to build a movement, I guess, or maybe more. And in many ways, I wanted to understand to what extent this movement can be translated as an environmental justice movement. And trying to do that as a postdoc in Barcelona made me think that actually what I need to do first is to deconstruct a little bit the environmental justice concept. So I will explain how the movement itself inspired me to broaden the theory of environmental justice. So as a PhD, I became curious about global justice movements, anti-capitalist, anti-globalization movements. That was my curiosity. And it was a curiosity probably justified by what I could see was the lack of such movement and such research in former communist countries of Eastern Europe. Of course, there were studies, democracy studies in our region, yeah, if I can say so, that have been addressed issues of social justice and even of environmental problems, but they were all more or less addressed in terms of legacies of communist dictatorship. But the ongoing or the lasting conflicts that these issues were bringing about were still to be investigated. So I had very good mentors who told me that stop focusing on, this is just like I'm reminding myself of being a student, stop focusing on other countries, focus on your region. This is a methodological and post-colonial issue, I guess. But so anyway, my first question was how resistance, or how can we think of resistance more broadly? Resistance to capitalist democracy, let's say, or market democracy. How is this resistance articulated in a post-communist context? And that's when I got stuck as a student. I'm like, I have nothing to research, or what am I going to do? Where am I going to look at empirically? But somehow at the time I was asking myself this question, I saw a documentary called The Dark Side of Environmentalism. And that was a mini documentary financed made by the corporation that was proposing one of the largest open cast gold mining in Europe, actually, which was supposed to happen in this village in Transylvania called Roșia Montana. So that's when I realized that actually there is something going on that can be considered both progressive, environmentalist, dark environmentalist, nationalism, and all these labels that somehow I didn't know how to make sense of them. And it was the so-called Save Roșia Montana, one of probably the few transnational movements in Eastern Europe opposing mega development projects. I first visited Roșia Montana in the summer of 2007, when the conflict was very, very strong, when just taking interviews was very problematic, because the Roșieni, how they call themselves, the people of Roșia Montana, Roșieni, were already tired of giving interviews, already tired of being researched, but researched, let's say, by journalists, by all kinds of people who wanted to write about them. It doesn't matter they were writing pro or against. The feeling was of an exhaustion. So I found the easiest way as a student to actually understand better was to also become an activist scholar. Of course, I was sharing the same, let's say, social values and environmental values, so that was easier for me. Also because I was not necessarily a sociologist. My background is, let's say, political theory, political science. I don't like academic disciplines, but anyway. So I found the easiest way was to forget about me a bit as a student and support the movement because of my commitments and because I wanted to know not just what these people are expressing, but also what they are living every day in everyday life. So I was trying to become part of the local movement and also of the national networking that was developing and transnational. So I witnessed the networking emerging with its tensions and victories, and most of all I was interested in what the locals were feeling and the long conversations that you have over a glass of wine in the evening, for example, when perhaps it's much more easier than in a formal context to express what was for me in the first paper ambiguity, to say the least, ambiguity about capitalism, development, and liberal democracy. Yeah, I already said about this. So yeah, I mean, academically speaking and as a research question, I had, the interest to see how these movements are emerging in a post-communist context, how do they articulate visions of justice. I wanted to show a little movie, but I didn't have the time. This is a bit like where I lived for a while, I stayed. This is the legacy of historical mining, let's say. The region has been historically a mining place, which actually complicated the whole environmental issue, or simplified it, depending on whose side are you taking. So yeah, I mean, in a way I was interested to show how Roșia Montana was a grassroots movement, although even that I can't say that is totally true. And many times I said that it was from the beginning a transnational one, given the connections that this movement or these people have made from the beginning with let's say, international NGOs and transnational activists. But just to say very few words, in 2002, before I arrived there, actually this village was a home for 2,000 people. And in proposing this open cast mine, the corporation capitalized a lot on locals' dreams of financial gains, market jobs, and other material gains. So in 10 years, approximately 80% of the properties were sold and became properties of the corporation. Even if since the beginning there was high skepticism about the promises of mining, even if from the beginning people were ambiguous about it, but I guess there was a very strong climate that there is no other alternative, of course. Even if prospective drillings, poisoning of land and animals, and the uncertainty of future jobs didn't stop Rochien from feeling compelled to leave the area, and or if they didn't, living in a continuous nerve-wracking pressure to leave the area. And despite the corporation remarketing its message as an ecological improvement, the Russians were talking about the fact that they don't care about us people, they just want our land. So it was visible that it was not even a job prospect. It was not development in the sense of caring about jobs. It was not development in the sense of caring about greening the area. And as I said, the the grassroots opposition was national and transnational. Maybe it's a mistake to say that it grew as transnational, so it's very hard to say. This is a different discussion. But in any case, at the national level, it became more and more of an interest and of a, let's say, of a cause for struggle for many NGOs and not only NGOs, the Romanian Academy, the universities, the churches, the public personalities, the European Parliament. This is, again, I'm emphasizing this not as a recipe for movements, not as a celebratory aspect, but as a reality that actually brought about much more complications in a way. It became an emblematic movement. It kind of opened up a Pandora box of civil society, if you want. And if any of you is familiar with what is happening nowadays in Romania, I would say that we can only see the results of this mobilization as a growing conflictual political climate in Romania. Whether that's wrong or right, I don't care. This is not how I address, let's say, justice. So in my first papers, I told the stories from a more, let's say, personal and local perspective, as living in a drama of uncertainties and ambivalence about what was perceived as a non-choice, tormented subjectivities, confronted with different senses of what just and unjust is. And I think at the level of personal and subjective, let's say, sense-making, is much more telling in a way than at the level of NGO or formal institutional expression. It was the feeling that everything was breaking up families by buying younger generations or convincing and intimidating older generation. And so intimidation and blackmail was even more violent, I would say, than perhaps corruption. Because those people who decided to stay and to make their staying in the region as a sign of resistance, they had to live with the everyday stress and everyday anxiety of having to not buy into many things, including bribes and corruption, which was something that politicians did easily solve. They just accept the bribe and they were happy with the mine. So the movement started to organize itself in the very, very basic terms of anti-commodification, and this is very typical language of critical, let's say, or resistance movements all over the world. Some things are not for sale. And the interesting thing is, again, the ambiguity of the fact that most Russians were owners, they were talking about their property. They were not talking about the fact that, not only about the fact that water should not be for sale, that mountains should not be for sale, but if even their own property is just a matter of sell it or not sell it, how can we even talk about liberal democracy? So refusing commodification was an important aspect. And I've been talking about these different layers of commodification in a different paper, connecting it with, let's say, moral economy, if you want. They were also talking about the fact that death should not be for sale. Because obviously the cemeteries would have to be moved. They were also talking about the fact that ancestry should not be for sale, or that homes should not be for sale, or that commons, or patria, if you want, should not be for sale. Again, all these, let's say, values are problematic when they start being translated in ideological terms, but this is not my purpose here. So there were many forms of mobilization in the last 15 years. All the typical civil rights, social justice discourses, coalition politics, asking for recognition of people as equally human to have the rights of citizens, the rights of humans, autonomy, dignity, to be consulted at least in official meetings, or when they are consulted, to be listened, to actually participate, to be recognized as people who live out of their livelihood, or what Martinez Alier would call environmentalism of the poor. their environment at least not being an ecological fashion, but at least to be recognized that their environment is the place of where they live, where they eat, where they work, and all these important aspects. So all the typical forms of mobilizations that you can read here, from official petitions to artistic, creative activities, legal activism, alternative media, and even socializing property rights, which I think is a very interesting aspect. So here's like where I stopped a little bit and asked myself, how is it that despite applying all these typical justice mechanisms that standard environmental justice and injustice theory is talking about, how come we were still, the movement and the situation, the conflict was still ongoing? And something happened in 2013 that inspired me to make the argument of undoing environmental justice theory, when the government proposed to change the mining law so that all extractive activities by private companies to be considered for public utility. This was the proposal that was followed by unprecedented mobilization in Romania, when tens of thousands of people in the streets of major cities expressed their indignations for a long period of time, maybe almost 2 months. And of course, they managed to make enough scandal so that they stopped this proposal for changing the mining law. But the interesting fact for me was that this mobilization, these protests, didn't necessarily have main slogans related to justice. The main slogans have been about a new revolution of our generation, and about the fact that the corporation should not make legislation. The term got deleted there. Should not make. Yeah, maybe. That's good. Should not make. So in my previous paper on doing environmental justice, I was basically saying that in a way we have to see the movement, the Roșia-Montana movement, as a conflict, not necessarily over justice, but over the common itself, over which situation is best to be applied. It was a dispute over the situation itself, to use Rancière words. That is, the situation being a pre-instituted, preconceived framework of reasoning, the undisputable need for more economic growth and technocratic decision-making, or the post-political consensus that more urban political ecologists are now talking about. In this sense, I've noticed by being around the Roșieni, and this was something that impressed me the most, that their ambiguity turned into more and more indignation of not having or not wishing to be recognized just as partners in what they perceive to be criminal contracts against both themselves and the environment and their environment. So perhaps I kind of pushed the to think about social environmental justice in terms of equality, since as Rancière would say, before we even talk about justice, we should talk about preliminary problems of justice, and that is consensus, and that is invisibility of people as political agents, and so on. I just want to stop a little bit here and give you a bit of a background on why I felt environmental justice theory doesn't give enough consideration to these issues, and not necessarily to the issue of equality, because it has always been a Marxist political ecologist approach, but somehow the environmental justice theory and the research didn't discuss, from my point of view, the situation, the preconceived terms of the discussion. The fact that in many of the so-called solutions about this development project, the terms of the discussion were already established by public-private representatives who commodify justice in the language of cheap licenses to operate and harm, financial donations to communities. The World Bank operational policies put an emphasis on the right to be informed and consulted on available options, guaranteed compensation at full replacement cost for losses. But as I was saying in my paper, what redistribution, or what this form of redistribution boils down to in development project is in fact resettlement, relocation, compensation, which shows ineffectiveness as ethically and politically reasonable, let's say, policies, because they don't safeguard against complex social risks, such as annihilation of entire communities and ways of life that may never be required, a phenomenon documented already as social disarticulation. So, in a way, everyday realities of prospective extractivism, which is what I'm writing about in a paper now, is the fact that this, even in the form of prospective extractivism, because we are not yet talking about extraction, we are not even talking about the mine operating, but even in this context of prospective extractivism, we have to talk about the preliminary problems of justice and not directly of justice. The fact that this form of these development policies already pin people down to oppressive positions and identities. They are becoming the surplus and disposable subjects that many critical theorists are talking about, for example, Tania Muraili. The fact that in mining conflicts it is often the case that the last thing people need is to be recognized as miners, albeit uninformed, uneducated, poor minority, having no choice but expose themselves to poison for having bread, as a historian Barca is writing about. So in this situation, people are invisibilized within a social imaginary of development and a greed of state economic recovery. And this invisibilization is perhaps not able to be redressed through recognition only. Even if redistribution policy secures a certain level of participation in consumer markets, it does not protect against being devalued as politically inferior. The last thing of the Russian wanted was to be recognized as politically inferior. It's a kind of demonization, and actually it's literally a demonization, because many times they were saying that we are just like cats and dogs in the street, or we are just treated like animals screaming for some private pain. We are not basically taken seriously in a public discussion, in a political, that is, discussion. The underdog is a form of injustice that cannot be easily commodified in law or repaired by increasing one's purchasing power. It invades everyday life, institutional practices as normative biases, and being denied political equality and agency is a very, let's say, is a systematic or a structural aspect of environmental and social injustice. And to ask for recognition or even intelligibility while being denied political visibility is to ascribe already superiority to those who are supposed to be in the position to offer recognition. So it's already a patronizing gesture, for example, as Butler would say. And this is a very dear friend of mine, Eugen David, who made me also think about the fact that there is something very insidious in the way injustice functioned in this conflict, because it was a form of invisibilization by inferiorization, if you want. This is the reason why Eugen is so angry, because it was not just about the fact that he was rejecting development. What he was rejecting was also not the drug of development as only a material fact, but the drug as a psychological or as a dependency issue more broadly than material dependency, political, if you want. So, if you put the situation in these terms, I say, the protesters were considered unreasonable. Yes, very simple way of becoming radical is to be called unreasonable, emotional, primitive, or all kinds of labels that put you down, because that's the most lame way of putting people down. No, the ultimate, or maybe the first. So the fact that they were questioning the very oligarchic minority which allocated rights and responsibility, and so what people like Eugen David were asking, why do I have to ask for better conditions for me as a slave when the regime of slavery is not recognized itself? They were so unreasonable because they were also answering yes to this question, the question that the corporation sent to the Soros Foundation. Interesting battle here. And the corporation is asking, is the G8 wrong about cyanide? Are the heads of the world's leading democracies violators of international law? Is the UN a conspirator in the use of cyanide? And if we answer yes, of course you are the unreasonable, crazy guy, like Eugen was often called, because they were not just opposing themselves being demonized as emotional or unreasonable, but they were opposing something that they perceived as illegal. Opposing a mind was considered opposing a consensus over a rule of law or over essentials of market democracy nowadays. They were not just opposing they were not even just opposing a global economic regime or capitalism, but a scientific consensus over technologies and the allowed risks of growth. So there was no surprise that themselves being called stupid peasants, even by the president here, who came to visit them, not to listen to them, but came to visit them to offend them very, very much and call them manipulated Bolsheviks and ecologists. Their unreasonable noise could not possibly make any sense for the president who lives in a world of consensus market democracy, who cannot be taken out of this distribution of the sensible, as Rancière would say. So Groscieni eventually had to tell them that if the president wants them to leave, as you can see here, Eugen David in the corner, he told the president, if you want us to leave, then you should just bring the military to drag us out. because you cannot convince us with your reasonable, sensible world. The same happened when the house of Eugen David, who is also the president of the local foundation of owners in Roșia Montana, he was visited by politicians, and Eugen is a farmer. He has cows and takes care of the land, and of course he welcomed the officials wearing his work clothes, dirty work clothes. And instead of answering his question to these politicians was, how come the corporation is offered a special law? What kind of legality is offering a special law to a corporation? And to this question, the politicians answered, how come you are not dressed properly? Didn't you know that we are coming? The discussion ended, and Eugen had to tell them to leave and never come back if they were interested just in putting him down and offending his identity as a peasant worker. This type of dialogue could not possibly be doing any justice to people like him, who are, first of all, invisibilized as political, as I said earlier. Pinning people down to a fixed identity and a fixed time and a fixed habitus, if you want. They felt that, Russian people like Eugen felt that their identity actually is a denial of other possibility. As Rancière would argue, the problem of addressing preliminary problem of justice is not about recognition of a group or even of an identity group. But because, as we can see, the injury that Russian felt was not just a misrecognition, but it's a denial of political agency and of themselves as people who have the power to produce the world they want to live in. Being recognized would mean to be legible, to be integrated within the grid of an existing structure, to talk to the president. But if the talk was not possible, then they are misrecognized or they are just invisible. As Ashish Nandi was arguing, theories of liberation work through the simplified practices of legibility that the state itself uses. Even if we try to articulate our dissent towards the state, we can only talk to the state by talking like the state. This is also a definition that Foucault gives to power. If you imagine your resistance in a certain way, it's still an effect of power relations. So it's a bit of a deadlock here. It's what, for example, Judith Butler would say, self-defeating, or the limits of these theories would be that they are self-defeating. They are fixing, presuming, constraining the very subjects it hopes to liberate. So in a way, considering another slogan of these movements, Ce vrem noi e și pentru voi, what we want is also for you, the Roșia Montana became more and more of an issue of the majority of citizens, let's say, in Romania, because they felt that they are also potentially invisibilized if or when the corporation would make legislation. They could be potentially silenced and anonymous in this consensual way of thinking. So why is this not about groups and their recognition of rights? I discussed in my previous paper that justice can be seen as a process of subjectification, in the sense that the identities of Russian had to be somehow reinvented politically, that they are not just fixed identities that we already know as peasants, or fixed identity as nationalists, or fixed identities as women. In this process of reinventing the political, you have to reinvent all the political subjectivities, even if they sound familiar to us. The peasant has to become, again, the peasant in the new configuration of power relations. The community economies, or what people have been doing traditionally to make ends meet, to make life possible, has to be reinvented politically if the violence of the state makes them invisible politically. Homemaking, patrimony making. Here is where I want to stop again and go to a very, very dear expression in political ecology. Nature does not exist. So one of the most important things that I learned, or that I reflect on in my political ecology courses, was that compared to, let's say, environmental approaches that reified the environment as pristine and wild, the environmental justice and political ecology are trying to re-emphasize the importance of people and broader socio-economic and cultural frameworks, and understand the dangers or the violence of even saving nature. So basically, nature has to be seen has to be reinvented politically, or has to be seen as a political and social construct in order to see the danger of saving it by selling it. What is the major discussion nowadays in political ecology, the ecosystem services and commodification. And I love this quote from Kathleen. Kathleen is a friend of mine that I think she didn't realize the brilliance of this phrasing. Pricing of life offers to nature the opportunity to earn its own right to survive in a world market economy. So let's cut this into more. First, do we want to survive? Second, in order to survive, we have to have certain rights, not just nature, just put it on us, yes? So in order to survive, we have to have certain rights. And in order to have certain rights, we have to work for them. We have to earn them. And this is just an opportunity, and this can be done only if we commodify justice, meaning putting a price on justice, or putting a price on life. I'm playing with the words here because I am trying to offer a critique to the, let's say, democratic rights theory of justice itself, and of the danger to commodify nature's right, the political danger of talking about nature's rights itself. In the critical political theory, there is already a lot of discussion about the problems and the limits of human rights in doing justice. But in the field of, let's say, environmental and political ecology, this issue of rights, it's still a celebratory, or it feels celebratory, and here's the danger again that I want to address. I'm still working on it, but I'm getting there. And NGOs have been, in this respect, handmaids to governmentality, as Brian would say, in the sense that if we admit that what Alain Boudiou would say, that where is the quote? I had a quote from Alain Boudiou, just one second, that I like very much. After the rights of man, the rise of the rights of nature is a contemporary form of the opium of the people, gigantic operation in depoliticizing subjects. I like very much this quote Not just because it talks directly about what is nature, but about because it reminds us that even before we talk about the rights of nature, we should discuss again seriously about rights and human rights and the capacity of human rights to do justice for people. What about for nature? So the focus on human rights, and this is where I want to kind of end, it has been a strong focus on in social environmental justice theory. Basically, boiling down to the right of every person of all races, incomes, cultures to a decent and safe quality of life. And it's considered a useful place to start in mediation and global and local environmental rights themselves, being group rights empowering local cultures. But, since when and how come activities like living, working, learning, playing, eating are just rights to be defended? Why are they not just nature or like something natural, let's say? I'm pushing again the terms precisely because I want to problematize addressing justice just in terms of human rights. And here is where people like Deleuze and Rancière and Badiou are helping us. These quotes are, I think, very good. What social democracy has not given the order to fire when the poor came out of their territory or ghetto? Human rights will not make us bless capitalism. Human rights had just been rejuvenated in the 70s, 80s by the dissidents movement of Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. A rejuvenation that was all the more significant as the formalism of those rights had been one of the first targets of the young Marx, so that the collapse of the Soviet Union could appear as their revenge. I think this focus on human rights, or I used the label of human rights to refer to all the rights to participate, the right to consultation, the right to even mobilize, all these rights that seem so allowed. They were allowed in Russia, Montana. This is the reason we had such an amazing movement. They were allowed, but they were still empty. They are still empty, and the struggle is still going on. What is missing here? So perhaps we should think more deeply on what people like, French post-structuralists, if you want. They don't like themselves to be called like that, but do whatever you want. I know geographers in mainstream academia would hate this label, but I don't care. Seriously, I don't care, because I already had this fight in the first publishing of my paper. And okay, if the French post-structuralists, or whatever you call them, are telling this, and this seems to me as something important to say, I'm going to say it, even if it's not fully Marxist or fully critical theory as academically accepted. But paradoxically, the focus on human rights does not disrupt power. It may actually augment it. It may actually grow it, in the sense that Foucault has talked about power as producing the forces that it tries to control. It may insidiously spread the normalization of rules and procedures, which instead of changing the terms of the discussion altogether and structurally, spreads the normalization processes to the point that now we speak about selling nature in order to save it. In other words, the table of negotiation is just another massacre, but at a different level, of a different reality. I quote here from Rancière, "The attempt to get rid of politics by ousting the surplus subjects and replacing them with real partners, social groups, identity groups, and so on, is the fact that conflicts are turned into problems that have to be sorted out by experts, negotiated adjustment of interests. And this way, consensus means closing the space of political dissensus. The interesting thing about this quote of Badiou about the rise of the rights of nature as depoliticizing subject is, as I said, not only is that it's not only relevant nowadays about nature. I mean, think about it, that it's already a reality, a constitutional reality for some countries. Yeah, Ecuador has, for example, included nature rights in the constitution, so it's already a reality. Does this make any difference in Ecuador? As far as I know, not. Because extractivist projects are schizophrenically, if you want, going on in the same time with protecting sacred land, let's say. So the interesting thing is not just that it's about nature's rights, but a form of politicizing the debate of political agency, that the human rights itself, despite years of confirmation, are still something to be considered as a form of resistance and not just a form of compliance. We know, as, for example, Rancière pointed out that even Hannah Arendt talked about the fact that there is some sort of perplexity of human rights, that these are abstract principles and that in the end are invented for those. So they are invented by others for those who have no rights. The poor, the victims, the evicted, the depoliticized. But what is more interesting is that Rancière pushes the Hannah Arendt question even further when he asks, who is the subject of the rights of man? And it is not, as Hannah Arendt and later Agamben say, that they are for those who are not citizens, for whom there is no law, or for whom cannot be even oppressed. But basically, they do not exist. They are bare life. Their politics is the domination, power, the totalitarian, the Holocaust, the state of exception. The fact of rights is, as we may observe, already an inscription. It is the visible law, the equality before the law in most cases. So therefore, to repoliticize or revalue rights for Rancière was actually to build again and again the revolutionary case of human rights. So it's not just human rights as already exist that you can just demand. It's actually creating a revolution, repoliticizing. It's funny, repoliticizing human rights, as he would say, making them revolutionary again, in the sense that the woman, the French woman Olympe de Gouges, was saying, if women are entitled to go to scaffold, they are entitled to go to assembly. It's not just a feminist issue here. Obviously, equal-born women and men are not equal-born citizens, of course, but this statement of this woman is not just about the fact that bare life or private life, the life of women, domestic life, or the life that is sentenced to death, for example, is not political. This is the mistake that Hannah Arendt does. We already know that this life is political. Otherwise, there would not be so much control on the body of women. So we already know that this life, this bare life, private, domestic life, is already political. It does not need to be included. This is what Rancière says. It does not need to be included or even expanded as citizenship or as the right to rights. It presupposes equality. And this is, again, the issue that we really don't want to take seriously. That equality cannot be given by somebody else. You cannot demand equality. You can only enact it. Politics, for Rancière, begins with addressing this preliminary problem, the demonstration of equality, staging your own equality, staging yourself again and again as a political subject, which is what he calls subjectivization. It's a fancy term that my friends hate me for it, but it's not my term. So it's a... And to go back a little bit to this concept that I want to develop about minor majorities. I mean, why minor majorities and not just minorities? Environment, for everything I said, you know, in our region, in Central and Eastern Europe, there is so much talk about minority, but as I'm trying to say in this paper, minorities it sounds like just a EU report, you know, like it's just another commodification. Let's give the black man a little bit more money. Let's integrate the immigrant a little bit more, and we will be more and more and more humanitarian. But at some point, Rancière talks about this form of humanitarian or charity, and this is most visible in atrocities and in real conflict of war where people are actually dying. When rights are of no use, you do the same as charitable person do with their own old clothes. You give them to the poor. Those rights that appear to be useless in their place are sent abroad, along with medicine and clothes, to people deprived of medicine, clothes, and rights. It is in this way, as the result of this process, that the rights of men become the rights of those who have no rights, the rights of bare human beings, subjected to inhuman repression. They become humanitarian rights, the rights of those who cannot enact them, the victims of absolute denial of rights. The infinite justice of the US government. The US government using this term to make Rancière happy, actually, even if they actually deleted this term immediately after for some reason. But he says it was fairly appropriate to call it infinite justice. An infinite justice is not only a justice that dismisses the principles of international law, prohibiting interference in the internal affairs of another state. It is a justice which erases all the distinctions that used to define the field of justice. Distinctions between law and fact, legal punishment and private retaliation, police, war. All these distinctions are boiling down to a sheer ethical conflict between good and evil, the axis of evil. So this is the justice that we have nowadays, no? It's a simplification of the political as the ethical, the moral actually, that you can see in the most ridiculous way in the democracy of the US. But let's suppose, like Deleuze would say, to go back to this issue of minor majorities and why I'm not talking about minority, and he put it very well. Let us suppose that the constant or standard is the average adult, white, heterosexual, European, male speaking. A standard language. It is obvious that man holds the majority, even if he is less numerous than mosquitoes, children, women, blacks, peasants, homosexuals, and so on. This is because he appears twice, once in the constant and again in the variable form which the constant is extracted. Majority assumes domination. And as Rancière would follow, societies today are organized by the play of oligarchy, and basically speaking, there is no democratic government. There is infinite justice, but no democratic government in the political revolutionary sense. Government is always practiced by the minority on the majority. So we have to switch the terms. According to Deleuze, we have to become. We want to remain the minorities. If we want to occupy a more revolutionary place, we don't want to use the rights to become the majority. Like the Russian would say, I don't want to be recognized in the same criminal contract. I don't know if this makes any sense. But I will just finish with the. Do I have time? I'll just finish with the story, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts, because it's a dilemma that I have in the last week. because me and a few researchers writing about this case are contacted now by the lawyer's company who is representing Romania in the litigation against the corporation. So basically the corporation is suing now the state, the Romanian state, to ask for compensation. Funny, no? They took so many properties and they are still asking for everything. And now the state, after they labeled all this resistance as Bolshevik, they are asking for our help because they don't have the money to pay. And we tell them, you are the thief. Give the money back. You took the money from the corporation. The monies are yours. You didn't give us any money. We the people still don't have anything from this deal. Where are the money? It's a bit ironic, but I want to push this discussion because it's not just a discussion about the corruption of the main political party in Romania, which is the reason why Romania is again on the stories, you know, like, oh, we have this unprecedented mobilization, but somehow this mobilization, instead of being, the oligarch versus what is the people, who is the people, it's just the oligarch versus the technocrats. As if the technocrats until now didn't already have the power, didn't already use the bribes of the corporation in the last 20 years, didn't already prove that their justice is just as much as corrupt as the former communists, let's say, of the main party. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but thank you.
Hvala za posluh. Zdaj začnemo z vprašanjem. Prosim, če se pojavlja kakšno vprašanje, pomoč predosti, da lahko naslovite na predavateljstvo in posoditi.
Actually, the last question is very intriguing because it opens many questions, and I'm not going to open it now. It's a thing for it to be debated. But I was wondering what happened at the end of this case when it was kind of closed, or what happened with the community who was actually standing in the front line against the corporation. What was the end of the story? Let's say. Thank you.
Do I answer now or I wait for more questions? I can answer now. Thank you. I forgot to actually talk about this because I don't think it's a closed case, for sure it's not. I mean, the irony of this successful movement is that on the ground, in the local community, it's still an ongoing conflict. What happened is that the fact that they reinvented, let's say, themselves politically, allowed them, as I said, to both survive and in a way even to a certain extent, thrive. So what am I saying this? First of all, there are very few people left, okay? We are talking maybe 100 families. Second of all, the interesting thing is that some of the land has been divided so that there are more owners, so divided among the participants in the movement, which is, again, a good thing because it makes commodification of further land more difficult. Another thing is that a lot of the movement actors so we are talking about different forms, different NGOs, different organizations, have been supporting the local community, if you want, by organizing all kinds of political, cultural events, and that created more space for a way to survive. I mean, the Russians are talking about survival at this moment a lot. Some of them are talking about the fact that they are enjoying a different way of community flourishing by trying to, let's say, produce their own food again, even if it's so hard, trying to kind of diversify their, let's say, local economy, trying to do other activities that are so hard to imagine when actually you have been mostly a miner or a worker in that community. To imagine yourself as a public speaker or as a tourist guide, agro-tourism, all forms of trying to multiply the forms of resistance and the forms of activity, of life making. So it's a struggle. From my point of view, I'm trying to see both the so-called positive and negative sides, and I've been writing about both. But since it remains a struggle, not just locally, but politically at the national and global level, I would say, then the case is not closed. But yeah, still people have to survive. I don't know if this answered the question. I mean, I have other...
Jaz imam zdaj eno vprašanje, ker prihajam iz podobne regije, kot ste zdaj omenili tudi v Romuniji, da se je dejansko ta eksploatacija začela in velike korporacije tožijo za nek neupravičen zaslužek, ki bi ga lahko imeli. Jaz mislim, da je tukaj problem tudi skupne evropske politike, ki dejansko, bom rekel, po domače, počepne pred kapitalom. Razni prostotrgovinski sporazumi, ki omogočajo tem velikim korporacijam, da tožijo posamezne države ali pa regije, da nimajo ali pa ne bodo imeli zaslužka, mislim, da to ne gre v pravo smer. Da bi se mogla tudi Evropska unija dejansko preoblikovati v neko konfederacijo, ki bi bolj spoštovala lokalne zadeve, to se pravi neke prioritete in tudi posamezne države bi mogle bolj zaščititi neke nacionalne interese, tako na področju kmetijstva, okolja, gospodarstva, ne pa se prepustiti Evropski uniji, ki jim dejansko diktira neko politiko, ki dejansko vodi degradacijo posameznih držav in pa v bistvu bolj spodbuja nek kapital, ki dejansko ne gleda na nacionalni interes, ampak zgolj na svoj dobiček. Kaj menite o tem?
Thank you very much for this question. Actually, it gives me the opportunity to talk about something that I forgot again. This is great because this is actually how many, and Eugen David, the man that I was showing, a lot of the discussion is in that direction. Yes, what is the point of having a government if the government cannot serve its people? And this is also the reason why I think a very good result, to also answer the first question to a certain extent, a very good result of this movement is the fact that it took 12 years or 15 years, but we are dealing now with a new party, with a much broader movement than even the Rosia Montana created, and it's called the United with Safe Party, and it's a party that focuses a lot on precisely showing the corporate practices of not only the corrupt practices of not only corporations, but of government and of the European Union, of legal illegalities that basically support what you just said. So in a way, the fact that this movement actually managed to change so much the terms of the discussion, that a new party was able to appear, I think it's a great achievement. 10 years ago, nobody would thought that we would have another party out of this. Of course, there is a problem now that a lot of the more progressive, let's say, people are talking about the fact that this form of party politics tends to be, again, a bit too conservative, too nationalistic. There is always this danger of not knowing how much you can moderate between protecting your local and national, let's say, wealth, and how much by doing that you don't create injustice somewhere else. This is why the movement has not just produced this form of party or this it's also producing parties that are a new party, let's say, that is called demos, that are addressing or that are trying to discuss not only in terms of we don't want to pollute or to destroy this specific village or these specific countries. We just don't want to pollute. The point is not to send the garbage and the waste and the mine somewhere else. The point is, how do all these minorities, your village, my village, so many minorities, and I'm not talking you are white and men, and you understand by minorities, I'm talking about certain communities that somehow are always in this economy, are always already produced as marginal enough to be polluted, as unimportant enough to be exploited, to the point that even if it disappears, it's no problem, because capitalism works this way, no? It's a surplus of people. So the problem is not just a village or local culture, or at least the way I like to put it. I totally embrace your approach if we add this frightening issue that nowadays states are not about protecting or state democracies nowadays are not about protecting these communities. So it's a more structural problem. I don't even know what to call it. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I'm trying to point to both you are right, but you are also right. So the point is not to be just right, the point is how to revolutionize, let's say, this concept of community, I would say. I will just leave it like that. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a very similar question. To be honest, I got a little bit lost by your talk. I heard two talks, actually. I heard a very interesting talk in the beginning, and then you presented your experiences with this movement, and also you try to your way to deconstruct or question basic terms like justice and so on. And I learned a lot from the way the people got more engaged in becoming political subjects, and people disconnect political subject that questions the way of how Romania, maybe also other countries are governed. And then I heard a second talk about a lot of quotes. And to be honest, I can't follow all these quotes, and I feel a lot of authority in these quotes. And I feel a little bit, I would say, what can we learn from the quotes in the second part of your talk on how this kind of struggles and how this conflicts within certain countries, but also across these countries. It's not only about communities, it's also about how we can connect communities to each other, how we can create movements that are able to change something. Yeah, we have discussed yesterday with the degrowth movement, how we can change power relations in a way that we are part of an ongoing transformation, which is contradictory. And we need some categories to better learn from these contradictory practices. And I'm wondering, what can we learn from all the quotes in your second part of the presentation for this kind of structure? Of course, need a revolution, yeah, we can go this, but how we can achieve this? What means a revolution in the ongoing practice of unsustainable or absolutely price-driven capitalist development? I can't see a relation between this second part of your speech to this question.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right. It's I'm not perhaps I'm not here to give solutions. I mean, I already pointed out to solutions, and the technocratic solutions, if you want, are very simple. Yeah, communities unite, people unite, save Russia, Montana. This is already happening. And I put this in most of my papers, and it's fine. You know, I agree with everything you say. We have to have new platforms of networking. We have to have, I think for me, the most revolutionary, if you want, just to simplify the idea of revolution, is to create a new party. Yes, if you want. Yes, because this is what party politics is. You have to create new parties that change the terms of the discussion instead of keeping the same parties of new generation like us, who have to show the contradictions, because nowadays in Romania's party politics there are no contradictions actually. It's just some people who fight among each other who have more power, but it's no contradiction at the level of their activity. They both, let's say, main parties, the liberal and the former communists, are talking about the same thing. It's neoliberal politics. It's a consensus over how to change society. So if you want the revolution, the revolution that they were talking about is at least to these people who are talking about the revolution. And this is the revolution of their generation. I'm not talking through the loose. This is the terms that people have used. The fact that the loose or whoever might resonate with this is precisely because it can be about a new party, but it's so much more. It's about the transformation at the level of the sensible, at the level of how we perceive ourselves, to make clicks that it's not so easy to create community. Can the two of us go and create a community? Can we listen to each other? In a movement, for instance. The movement itself was such an explosion of tensions and of contradictions. The movement, I'm not even talking about the political climate. The movement itself was such an explosion of tensions that then you realize how hard it is to create a movement. Can we even talk about simply creating a movement? I would say that the methodological tools that we have nowadays from social movement theory are not enough to understand the difficulties of creating movements. At least they don't resonate with me. That's why I don't use them so much, from what I've seen. I don't know if this answers the question, but thank you.
Irina, thank you very much for a very rich presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed this. To follow up on the last question, there's a point in your paper where you say just on the bottom, is do we need rights to live, to work, to eat, to play, to love, etc.? And of course, this is, it speaks to the question of livelihoods.
Yes.
And of course, what is being stripped from these people is their livelihood.
Yes.
And what's being stripped from all of us eventually is our livelihood. And at the moment, internationally, and I'm sure you know this, that there is a convergence of interest in alternatives from every continent. And we just documented it, myself and some colleagues, in a post-development dictionary where we've gathered together visions of how livelihoods look in different cultures as a possible future material alternative to capitalism. But the part perhaps that thrilled me, excited me most, was when you talked about disidentification and re-identification. And because it's so difficult in our work, and very difficult for students, I think, to think at the individual level without thinking ideologically. So they're thinking always in terms of identity politics, of fixed subjectivities. And you demonstrated, and I personally experienced this in this kind of struggle, this process of de-identification from the given identity and a growth and a reconstitution of a new reality. And in terms of moving forward in political ecology, I think we need to pay a lot more attention to analysing processes at the individual level, but in a way that pushes identity politics back. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know. I think you put it very well. This is actually, sorry, I cannot see you and talk in the same time. This is actually the main focus of my work, and as you said, it sounds so soft. And we know, perhaps women more than men, that this is not soft at all. That you have to weaken to the point that you become stronger. I don't even know how to express this. I'm still working on this. But yes, to weaken in order to become stronger is to become a minority, to see the strength of the minorities, the many women, the many peasants, the many who are seen as peasants, as if peasant is just a fixed identity, or as if woman is just a fixed identity. I don't know. But this is what I felt in Russia, Montana, that even if you cannot give up your fixed identity of peasant, you are forced to reinvent it, simply because even your fixed identity is sentenced to death. So if you're sentenced, if you want to be a peasant, which is not a problem, let's say, in the sense that you can, even if you are recognized, let's say, that your activity is important, is productive, no? Because we have to say that peasantry is an important category. But even if you are recognized as such, the fact that you are forced to create your livelihood with the genetically modified seeds, for example, is that a peasant or is that a consumer? So in that sense, you have to reinvent peasantry, which is what I'm doing now in a new project with my friend Rita Calvario, who writes about seeds and alternative food. And I'm totally aware of this amazing group of scholars who are not just political ecologists, but they are eco-Marxist and degrowth, post-development. I just finished a paper on degrowing environmental justice. So in that sense, yes, I am very much in that direction, if you want. programmatically, although I don't think it's necessarily programmatic because it sounds so unreasonable, but that it cannot be recognized as such, no? Too many. Thank you.
May I?
Sorry, I didn't. Oh.
Rekli ste, da ko je prišlo do tožbe sedaj te korporacije do vaše države, da to pravzaprav ni vaša stvar. Gospod Zato je že omenil, da imamo podobno situacijo v Sloveniji, kjer korporativno podjetje toži sedaj državo. Sama se ne strinjam. Pred sprejetjem CETE v Sloveniji so nas strokovnjaki opozarjali na to vrsto problematiko, da lahko pride do tožb velikih korporacij tudi držav in nekateri suportivi sprejetju CETE so zagovarjali, da do takih zadev ne bo nikoli prišlo. Slovenija je relativno majhna država in si pravzaprav takih tožb ne more privoščiti, saj v končni fazi države smo tudi ljudje in vsi dajemo v to skupno malho. Te dni pa sem se s kolegi, mlajšimi kolegi pogovarjali o drugi problematiki. V Sloveniji namreč več ni možno študirati mednarodnih odnosov, to pomeni, da pravzaprav znanje, ki nastaja nekje v Evropski uniji in znanja, ki nastajajo v veliki CETE, pravzaprav ni več moč enakovredno slediti. Poleg tega tudi ne vem, kako visoko kvalitativno znanje imamo v mednarodnem pravu. Zgodi se nam namreč lahko, da v vseh teh tožbah začnemo izgubljati in da pravzaprav ne, da postanejo sužnji posamezniki, ampak da lahko prekarno postane celoten narod. Sama sem mnenja, da ni, mislim, eno je, da se upremo in gremo ljudi na ceste, pa vendar kasneje se nekako je treba usesti in če nismo enakovredni sogovorniki, nas enostavno ne bo več. Kaj storiti?
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is a great question. Isn't actually that's why I said that it's the dilemma of my last week. You know what? I mean, it's not just about me. You know, like whether if I go to support the state with all my knowledge, let's say, to support the state so that the state will not pay this money back to the corporation, which is something incredible. You know, like. Why would you pay the corporation when the corporation bribed like most of the politicians, most of the media? It's outrageous. But the most outrageous thing is that who would I support? Who is this state, you know? Of course I want to help my citizens who actually give the money to the state so that the politicians, you know, steal this money and they go to Brazil and make a good living out of our money in Brazil or in other countries where they don't have to pay taxes or they don't, you know, they have their paradise in many ways. But the problem is not whether me or all these thousands of activists and scholars and everything will not support the state. The problem is how to reinvent the state in this question. That's why I think perhaps creating new laws, creating new parties is not just revolutionary but necessary in this context, when you really have to repoliticize democracy, to repoliticize yourself as a citizen. It's a very complicated question. I cannot tell you that I have the answers, and I cannot have the answers. I'm just a researcher, and I can only tell you that for sure the state will be supported in that sense. But the problem is that when you are inside the state, like most of these new parties, we have 2 new parties out of this movement, more or less out of this movement. We are talking about the same activists who always go in the street, like no matter the weather, no matter the life, you know, they make their private life public. I know these people, a lot of them. They don't, it's very hard to distinguish between private and public life when you are an activist like that. You don't have to anymore. So I trust that these people will support the state by going inside the state, but trying to change the state, if you want, from within, because otherwise you are talking about some representatives that don't represent you in the first place.
Just to add a tiny extra bit to this point, I mean, the corporations are so cynical, it's not even a matter of getting money back from the state. They have already backed themselves up with hedge funds, with insurance policies, which will pay them out if they have lost money through any kind of risk. So,
thank you. Yeah, not to mention the fact that they made money off the speculations on the global markets. So it's not like they lost their time, They don't even care about doing the mine. They are making money, giving money, making money,
Yeah, I'm Boštjan, and first of all, thank you very much for your really wonderful paper. Actually, to be honest, I was just passing by and really excited to see at the kind of political ecology conference people engaging with most important years of late 20th century philosophy. And for me as a philosopher, I'm really glad to see that perhaps there is still a future for philosophy. Seriously. I would just have a brief observation regarding the point when you were mentioning Arendt criticizing a bit her about whether the domestic sphere is a political or non-political. Because, yeah, perhaps you're right to claim that following her take on ancient distinction between public and private, the sphere of political and sphere of the domestic oikos. But on the other hand, I would say it's not political in these terms. I would suggest the better term to use is biopolitical. Because that's according to, okay, on the one hand Foucault, but the state was mostly developed by Adam, and what actually happened in modernity is the overlapping between two spheres that were in pre-modern times separated. So, and that's from this overlapping between the sphere of private, or let's say reproductive biological, and the sphere of private, where biopolitics emerges.
Thank you. I was hoping you will come. I mean, here I didn't want to go into this discussion too much because it's really not the time and the place, but I will probably include this discussion. I will have to include this in the paper, in the actual paper, where is more space for that. But the thing is that Rancière actually engages in a critique with Agamben. As far as I understood, Rancière is a bit challenging this concept of biopolitics or of bare life, because he says that it doesn't mean if it's a bare life, it's not political. If you call for a state of exception, then you kind of tend to take out the political dissensus, the political conflict out of it. So he prefers to say that bare life or biopolitics is still not just about disciplinary, it's still also about sovereign power to kill. Exactly, yeah. So this is something that I need to clarify more. So I'm glad that you pointed out, but it's just that, I didn't. So my interest in this was not just this difference, but my interest was to simply point out that this, let's say, life or this right to life, it's not something that you just have. It's something that you have to stage over and over again. So even your right to life, it's absurd, but this is the reality of democracy. You have to prove that you deserve the right to live. You have to prove that you deserve the right to eat. If you don't talk in these terms, you totally ignore the minorities of people who are dying of starvation nowadays in Argentina, in many, many, many countries. No? I just remember Argentina because it's very connected with the economic crisis, no? So, do we need a revolution for that? Of course, like if our democracies can't even guarantee this, basic right, what did we do in the last years, What happened? Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I actually am very, I started to think about the question you put to us, this, the corporation now suing the state, and I guess from the politicians coming to you as academics who have data, who have resources to support them. And I think it's actually a very interesting question because Romania, like Slovenia, are actually quite new to the business of democracy. We have to learn values and ethical behavior in the democratic sphere. And our politicians very often forget that they actually are elected, they have duties, they have moral standards to adhere to, through which they are accountable. So I very much feel your dilemma as an academic. What should I do? Shall I support the government in buying out of this? Or shall I support the democratic standards that somebody has to be accountable for the wrong decision taken? Because it's also a process of learning, like Slovenia is still learning how to, the Slovene political elite is still learning how to behave in a political space. And very often they take decisions for which they're not accountable, and that seems to be, your case seems to be one of them. So I'm not sure how the legal procedures are being placed out, but there are responsibilities in this sense that need to be demonstrated. It's a big damage that has been done, so somebody has to be accountable. Otherwise, we were over and over had these kind of cases, and there are many countries where you have them, because nobody is accountable, and then eventually it falls back to the citizens, either because they put a mine and people get sick, or because tax money is being used to repair damage. The tax money, it's a public resource, we use it for schools, for hospitals, so it's a resource that's being taken away. So it is a dilemma, and I think a political science accountability concept can be quite useful to be brought up and used to raise awareness on how to implement democracy in its full.
Thank you very much. Yes, exactly. I mean, of course, I totally agree. The problem is that when this, this is happening in Romania. So more and more politicians are, more and more activists and more people are celebrating the fact that we find the thieves. And in many cases, there is justice done through the legal system. but of course the money don't go back. Like, the money disappears. So, and the problem is that in this process of legal trials kind of transformed itself into a political revenge between parties. And now they just put each other to prison for a while, and they say, oh no, you stole more, and I stole more, but you stole more, and you know, they all go to prison, and then they go to Brazil. I'm very cynical here, but I don't know how to put it very simply, you know, like it's really how do you reinvent maybe the legal system. That's why there is so much discussion about the independence of judiciary. And yes, you have to have an independent judiciary, but it's already a mafia. This is the problem. This is why probably Tania Murali is talking about mafia. It's a mafia. How do you ask for accountability from mafia? And I'm not talking about the corporation here, I'm talking about the state. Do I want to talk with people that I know that they just like to say each other, you are more thief than I am? So what do I tell them? You are both thief. What are the categories to make justice here? I'm not a legal person, and it's very hard for me to talk about this, but this is what very bluntly put. It's like we were talking earlier, to put it very bluntly, even if we solve the problem of the environment by reducing the carbon, even if we convince Trump somehow to reduce carbon's emission, Trump will make business out of that, and the society will stay shitty, just as it is. I don't know, I want to push this, because it's really not a matter of X and Y politician. It's so much more than that.